If you're selling a house in Ontario with tenants and you're evicting the tenant for the buyer's personal use, this is everything that you need to know. My name's Daniel Hale. I'm a real estate agent in Ontario and I help a ton of landlords with their properties, and I sell a lot of tenanted properties. So if that's you and you need help, make sure you subscribe and give me a call if you need my assistance. Let's jump right into this. Evicting a tenant for the buyer's personal use. The first thing that you need to know is you can't just order that and make it happen. In Ontario, the tenant does have the right to a landlord and tenant board hearing if they choose to take one. So make sure you don't just say, hey, buyer, I can give you this property, I'm gonna sell it to you, evict my tenant, I'll guarantee you vacant possession, because this could actually get you sued and cause you a lot of stress and headache if that tenant doesn't move out on that vacancy date that you promised. Now, sometimes you might have the nicest tenant in the world. I've seen this all the time. But then once you tell them you're selling, everything changes and they start making demands, getting very mad, frustrated, and upset. So just because you have a nice tenant that's telling you everything, I'm gonna move out, I'm gonna do this, don't worry about me, make sure you still take the appropriate steps, which is serving the N12 notice of eviction to the tenant for the buyer's personal use. Now, if somebody's buying the property, they need to use that property for a period of up to 1 year for their personal use, their spouse's personal use, their child's personal use, or their parents' personal use. Anything outside of that, you cannot do it. So if they're an investor, you cannot just sell it to them for their personal use. It doesn't work that way because they're an investor, they're gonna rent the property. So you need to serve an N12 notice of eviction to that tenant. And you need to make sure that you file that notice to the landlord and tenant board as well. I've seen this happen so many times where people give a notice to the tenant and they just expect the tenant to abide by it and they're gonna leave because you gave it to them. And they might not leave on that termination date on the N12. So if you don't file the notice to the landlord and tenant board, and you've only served the notice to the tenant, if the tenant doesn't leave, you don't have a hearing date, so you actually can't get them evicted, and the tenant's gonna kick their feet up and say, well, there's no hearing date, I don't need to stress, I'm gonna stay here. So file that notice to the landlord and tenant board as well, and get your hearing date. Now with the N12 notice, it has to be served to the tenant before they pay rent. So for example, if they pay rent on May 1st, their termination date will be the last day of June, which is the 60 days, but it goes until the last day of that month. You need to also provide that tenant with compensation of a total of 1 month's rent. You'll see that on the N12. You are obligated to give this to the tenant before the termination date is up, regardless if they're kicking their feet up and not moving and going to a landlord and tenant board hearing, because the landlord and tenant board will also ask if you paid that compensation. Make sure that answer is yes. Now in Ontario at the time of this video, when we file N12s, we're looking at hearings within about a 4 to 5 month period. So don't be guaranteeing vacant possession to that buyer on a specific date as well. Make sure you have the right to extend it. Make sure the buyer understands if that tenant doesn't leave that you, the seller, have the right to extend it. Because if that tenant doesn't leave, the only person that can actually evict the tenant is the landlord and tenant board hearing. So you need to get that hearing within that 4 to 5 month period, get your eviction order, and then you can take the next steps and guarantee your vacant possession when you know what date the tenant will be gone. Now the steps of the landlord and tenant board are, you file the notice to the tenant, you then file the notice to the landlord and tenant board, you attend the hearing, you have to see what the outcome of that hearing is. Now if you're doing everything lawfully though, and you file the notice to the landlord and tenant board, you show them the deposit that the buyer paid, you file the agreement of purchase and sale, and the buyer attends the hearing, everything looks extremely lawful and above board, and you will win and you will get that eviction. Then the landlord and tenant board will tell the tenants you must move out by this date. Now again, I know it sounds crazy, but this is Ontario. Do not then promise the buyer is able to move in on that date that the landlord and tenant board says the tenant needs to move out. Because if the tenant still doesn't move out, you then need to pay to have the sheriff arrive and evict the tenant, which can take up to another 6 to 8 weeks depending on the city that you're in. And then the sheriff will then give you a date that they are going to arrive and evict the tenant. Then my recommendation is to you, you can promise vacant possession to the tenant after you have that sheriff notice of when he's going to arrive, but give yourself another couple of days to make sure that all of his belongings are out. Make sure that the property is clean, because believe it or not, I've actually seen it where a tenant's still there when the sheriff arrives, and the way that the law works in Ontario is they have 72 hours to now come back and get all of their stuff. Otherwise, it's deemed as the landlord's belongings and he can throw them out. So you always want to give another 3-4 days after that, just to make sure all the belongings are out, the property's clean, and in a good state for the buyer to take possession. Now, I know this is a lot of steps. There is another way around this if the tenant agrees and they're not too crazy about what their demands are. You can do an N11 notice, which is an agreement to end the tenancy amongst the tenant and the landlord on a specific date. Most of the time, this comes in the form of cash for keys, where the landlord gives some compensation to the tenant and helps them out with their move, and in exchange, the tenant signs the N11 and they agree to a termination date and the tenant moves out. I've done this many times. However, if the tenant's asking for a crazy amount of money, which I have seen many times, I'm talking $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, don't do it. Just go through the process, work with the buyer, because that amount of money is insane. And if you need help selling your tenanted property in Ontario, give me a call, shoot me an email, or send me a text. I'll be happy to help you guys get this done stress-free.